It revolutionized tank building, played an important role in the Battle of the Marne during the First World War. Today, it holds a leading position in the European electric car market. A look at the most significant chapters in Renault's history. How collaboration with the Nazis led to the tragic end of French inventor and company founder Louis Renault. And how a brilliant marketing move changed the fate of a small Pyrenean village. In September 1914, Paris stood on the brink of conquest. Just 40 kilometers from the French capital, German troops were positioned along the Marne River. They were successfully executing the so-called Schlieffen Plan, the Kaiser's army deployment strategy at the outset of World War I. German forces advanced through Belgium and Luxembourg to strike Paris. On September 5, Anglo-French forces launched a counteroffensive that would go down in history as the First Battle of the Marne. This battle would determine whether Germany could secure a swift victory on the Western Front. And in this decisive confrontation, Parisian taxis played a crucial role.
When the Germans broke through the front, a whole division was transferred with the help of a taxi just to a vulnerable piece of the front. And this decided the fate of Paris.
A total of 1,100 taxis were used, mostly Renaults. Each vehicle made 2 trips. On the way to the front, they carried 5 soldiers per car. On the return journey, they evacuated the wounded. The Anglo-French forces won the First Battle of the Marne, crushing Kaiser Wilhelm II's hopes for a swift victory over France. Renault taxis became forever known as the taxis of the Marne. The mastermind behind these iconic French automobiles was a child prodigy obsessed with machines, Louis Renault. Born in 1877 into a wealthy, large family, he spent his childhood tinkering with various mechanisms. Louis felt truly happy only when his hands were covered in grease.
At the age of 21, he designed and built his very first car, the Voiturette. On the night of December 25, 1898, as Paris celebrated Christmas, Renault amazed onlookers by speeding through the city streets at an astonishing 50 km per hour. He also managed to climb Montmartre's steep 13-degree incline, a remarkable feat at the time.
This impressive and spectacular debut resulted in an immediate 12 car orders, and Renault realized that his passion could become a highly profitable business. The following year, he joined forces with his brothers, Marcel and Fernand, to establish the company Renault Frères, Renault Brothers.
Their first logo featured the initials of all 3 founders. But most importantly, their surname appeared twice, creating a distinctive, mirrored design. This was their first official emblem.
Business took off immediately. Within the first 6 months, the company had produced 80 cars.
Louis focused on manufacturing and innovation, while Marcel and Fernand handled promotion. To popularize their automobiles, they participated in numerous races, a strategy that significantly boosted sales. However, the 1903 Paris-Madrid race ended in tragedy for the Renault family. Marcel failed to navigate a turn, suffered severe injuries, and died 2 days later.
From that moment on, Louis stopped racing personally, though Renault drivers continued to compete. In 1906, Hungarian driver Ferenc Sis won the French Grand Prix behind the wheel of a Renault AK.
A race car became a prominent feature of the company's logo.
5 years later, citing health issues, Fernand Renault stepped down, leaving Louis as the sole leader of the company. Then came World War I. By that time, Renault had expanded its production to include buses and trucks. Louis Renault donated this transport fleet to support the French army. Louis Renault's company also began producing artillery shells. Large conflicts boost the military industry. The First World War was a war of new technologies with which people used to destroy each other. Machine guns, poisonous gases, and tanks appeared in military theaters.
Different nations pursued different tank designs. The British built tanks with tracks running around the entire body. The Germans developed a tank with a large crew, but it moved sluggishly across the terrain.
Meanwhile, in 1916, Renault engineers designed a tank concept that would go on to shape modern armored warfare, a design still in use today.
Firstly, the tank's commander was strategically positioned at the front, with the combat compartment situated in the middle and the engine compartment located at the rear. Only their revolutionary tank, the Renault FT-17, was designed with a turret that could rotate a full 360 degrees, providing unmatched flexibility on the battlefield and allowing the crew to fire from either a powerful cannon or a machine gun in any direction, regardless of the tank's orientation.
The Renault FT-17 weighed about 6.5 tons, was 5 meters long, and had either a 37mm cannon or a 7.92mm machine gun, reaching speeds of 8 km per hour. From 1919 to 1923, the image of this tank was featured in the Renault company logo.
Based on the FT-17, the Italians developed their own tank, the Fiat 3000, which was lighter and faster than the original. In the United States, the M1918 was created, also known as the two-seater Ford.
By the end of 1918, a small number of 1917 tanks, by mere chance, ended up in Ukraine. These tanks were eventually captured by the advancing Soviet forces. These were advanced, state-of-the-art vehicles. The Red Army soldiers were astonished by them, and they decided to send one of these tanks as a gift to their beloved leader, Vladimir Lenin.
Lenin realized that he was holding very modern technology in his hands.
For a country that was actively engaging in acts of aggression, such advanced technology was absolutely essential. There's even a decree from the Council of People's Commissars to produce identical tanks at the Sormovo factory.
The French tank was transported by rail to the factory in Nizhny Novgorod.
It was disassembled into parts, but some components went missing. Where did they disappear? It's just that someone must have stolen them for themselves. Even the gearbox disappeared along the way. The engine was disassembled, and the body along with the tracks were transported separately. By the time it arrived at the factory, it was like a Lego set. Many parts were missing, and there was no documentation.
The missing parts were produced in the Soviet Union. The modified tank was named Freedom Fighter Comrade Lenin. A total of 15 units were made. For his assistance to the French army during World War I, Louis Renault was awarded the Grand Cross of the Order of the Legion of Honor. He continued to work on his beloved projects. He invented hydraulic shock absorbers, modern drum brakes, and compressed gas ignition. He also founded around 30 subsidiary companies outside of France. By the time World War II broke out, Renault employed 40,000 workers. His company once again became one of the main suppliers to the French army.
Just before the outbreak of the war, at the 1939 exhibition, Louis Renault had the opportunity to meet with both Hitler and Göring. Upon returning to France, he openly stated that a large-scale war was inevitable and could not be avoided. He then traveled to the United States and urgently pleaded, saying, "Gentlemen, we desperately need your help, so that the Americans, with their military strength and presence, could step in as the peacekeepers."
When the businessman returned from the US, his country had already been occupied by the Nazis. The Americans offered Louis the chance to return and live peacefully in a still neutral country.
But he refused. Louis Renault said, "How can I abandon my creation?" During World War II, the Renault factories were used to produce a wide range of vehicles, including cars, trucks, buses, and tanks, all for the benefit of Nazi Germany.
Meanwhile, on both sides of the front, Renault FT-17 tanks were still being used.
By 1941, these tanks were no longer actively used in combat, but instead, they were strategically dug into positions along specific sections of the Western Front, particularly on the western borders, where they served as stationary firing points.
The Poles had resorted to this tactic as early as 1939. At the start of the war, the Wehrmacht forces first attacked the Brest fortress. The advance of General Guderian's motorized corps was held back by several thousand Poles, Ukrainians, and Belarusians. The defenders held out for nearly 2 weeks before the Germans, later assisted by Red Army soldiers, captured the fortress. The defenders of the citadel had 14 Renault FT-17 tanks. Some were dug into the ground in front of the fortress gates, turning outdated equipment into a nuisance for the Germans.
Some of the tanks even put up resistance, effectively halting the advance of German troops.
After the occupation of France, the Germans captured around 1,400 Renault tanks.
They were no longer used in active combat but were repurposed for guarding industrial facilities and airfields. The Germans didn't scrap them, instead, they added them to their arsenal.
Starting in 1942, Allied forces began bombing Renault factories that were producing vehicles and tanks for the Nazis. After the first air raid, Louis Renault suffered a heart attack.
He worked for the invading forces, specifically for the Nazis. How can one view him? Charles de Gaulle was absolutely furious when he learned that Renault factories were working for the Nazis. There can be no economy without politics.
When in 1944 the Allies freed France from German occupation, the businessman was arrested and charged with collaboration with the Nazis.
In October 1945, under mysterious and unclear circumstances, he was brutally tortured. He was beaten so severely that he later succumbed to his injuries and died in the hospital.
As for the factories owned by Renault, after the war, France nationalized them.
Today, the French government owns 15% of Renault and holds a decisive vote. Another 15% is owned by Nissan. The remaining shares are freely traded on the stock market.
During World War II, the Nazis didn't just produce military vehicles at the Renault factories. A few models of the civilian 4CV car rolled off the assembly line. Engineers had designed this model before the occupation of France.
The first models were produced in 1942, and by the end of the war, the production process gradually began to resume and increase once again. Mass production of this car officially began in 1946, marking the start of its widespread manufacturing.
The abbreviation 4CV stands for 4 fiscal horsepower.
The fiscal horsepower was calculated not based on the actual engine power but through a formula based on the engine cylinder volume. The actual horsepower was several times higher than the fiscal horsepower.
This model of Renault earned the nickname the piece of butter due to its compact size and color. The first models were painted in a sandy yellow color, which remained from the cars made for the African Corps of Hitler's favorite general, Erwin Rommel. Later, the 4CV also became known by the nickname 4 Paws.
The car stood out for its aerodynamics and cool optical design feature. The front doors opened against the direction of movement.
Nowadays, this concept is no longer used due to safety concerns.
The issue is that if the doors suddenly open at high speed, they act like a sail. Opening could cause a spin-out. There was no electronics, no stabilization. An open door indicated an emergency. Considering that the speeds were low and it was original from a design standpoint, the French, who have always loved design, used this concept.
This car won people's love. Over 15 years, more than 1 million units were produced. The queues for purchase sometimes reached 2 years.
Interestingly, while we had one tractor in the village, apparently on the track in the collective farm, French families rode such cars normally. My parents, if I think about it, were just starting to grow up, while the French were already cruising around in proper cars.
After World War II, Jean Riedel, the son of a Renault dealer and a passionate racer, began designing a racing car based on the Renault 4CV. In 1954, he took a major step by founding his own company, Alpine.
The name of the company reflects my passion for driving on mountain roads. The greatest pleasure in life I've ever had was driving my Renault 4CV in the Alps. That's when I realized I wanted to build my own car that could give others that incredible feeling.
The new company signed an agreement with Renault to supply engines and chassis. And in 1956, they presented the Alpine 106 model. The first 3 units were painted in the colors of the French flag, blue, white, and red, and were presented in the courtyard of Renault's headquarters in Billancourt. The racing car had a fiberglass body. Besides the usual 3-speed transmission at the time, a 5-speed gearbox was available as an option.
Driving this car was a lot of fun. It had a very simple engine you could rely on. Its engine capacity was only 750 cubic centimeters, but the chassis was extremely light. The car weighed just 560 kilograms. And I was faster than all the Abarths and Fiats with it.
In 1956, this model won the legendary endurance race Mille Miglia, 1,000 miles, and marked the beginning of a series of sporting achievements for the brand. For example, in 1973 the Renault Alpine team, with the A110 model, triumphed in the first season of the World Championship in Israel. The culmination came at the Monte Carlo Rally, where the French team took the first 5 spots on the podium.
In the early 70s, Alpine found itself in a difficult financial situation, and all its assets were bought by Renault. The brand continued until 1991. After that, the owners decided not to spend money on upgrading outdated rear-engine cars, and the brand disappeared for over 20 years. However, In 2013, it was revived.
In 1971, the company introduced the Renault R5, and the following year it launched it into mass production.
If you watch old movies, for example, with Louis de Funès, we recently rewatched them and concluded that in the post-war era, the automotive industries in France and Italy were quite weak, so weak that large American cars were highly valued. They were seen as something luxurious, while local cars were still quite small, lackluster, and primarily aimed at modest budgets with low fuel consumption.
The Renault 5 became one of those cars that broke this stereotype. It was a mass-market vehicle, with over 5 million units sold.
Conceptually, it was very advanced because it was a properly designed front-wheel drive compact car. Thanks to the efficient placement of all components under the hood, it featured a relatively high, quite rectangular body. The Renault 5 was spacious, and for its time it was truly a revolutionary car.
The company released a sporty version, the Renault 5 Turbo.
The engine was moved from the front to the rear, and it featured a turbo engine that powered the rear wheels. It was one of the wildest, said the drivers, one of the craziest cars made at that time. Collectors pay huge amounts of money for well-preserved models, because those that remain in good condition are truly extraordinary, and the car has certainly earned its place in the history of the automotive industry.